Well, we make no apology for being lobbyists. Absolutely no apology for being lobbyists on behalf of farmers, you know. But that involves a lot of leadership too. And there's leadership involved here because it's a really major issue. Brexit is a really major issue for farmers. I'll just, you know, cover some, you know, of the general, I suppose, points here. The obvious things. There's a massive dependency for Irish agriculture on the UK market. And if the UK pursues any kind of cheap food policy, which is a possibility, and it's certainly the stated objective of some Brexiteers, it would have major repercussions for us. That's clear. Obviously, the land border with Northern Ireland, that's been touched on here. And something else that's a factor in Brexit is the importance of the CAP budget, because if the UK leaves, there's going to be a hole in the CAP budget of about 10.5 billion euros net a year, a hole in the EU budget. So the importance of the UK market, goods exports there, you can see the share to Britain is of our goods exports for the first 7 months of this year, 12%. But when you get to the food exports side, it's 34%. So it's massive, our dependence. And when you look within different sectors, it's even greater than that. So people talk about diversification. Yeah, diversification, and there are great efforts being made by Bord Bia in that regard, Enterprise Ireland as well. But diversification, you can see there, you know, we've had some very good results there, to the USA up 43%, to the rest of the world up 22%. But the reality is that we're not going to diversify anywhere near fast enough to deal with Brexit unless Brexit takes a very long time. And I believe it will take a long time. But diversification cannot instantly solve the problems. Of course, it's an area where food companies need to focus. Even this year, our UK exports to the UK were up by 9% there. Okay. So, just looking at some of the key issues, the beef situation is hugely important. The UK is the market for 50% of our beef exports, about 270,000 tonnes. So that is a massive amount, 270,000 tonnes of beef. They're a net importer, and we are by far the biggest. You can see from the pie chart there, we're by far the biggest component of that. About 2/3 of their net imports are coming from Ireland. It's a high value market. That's important. So it's not just access to the UK market, it's the value of the UK market that's important for us. The other important point that has to be understood is that if we have difficulty accessing the UK market, or if the value of that market is reduced, there will be a displacement effect in terms of what happens to the continental EU market. In other words, if we can't go into Britain at current price levels, or there are other restrictions in terms of access, we will have to go to France, the Netherlands, Germany, and so on, Italy, those markets. And that volume of beef, even a part of that volume of beef, is enough to destabilize those markets and to devalue those markets for our European colleagues. On the dairy side, there's also a heavy dependence, particularly in cheese and butter. I think it's about 2/3 of our butter export, 2/3, we supply about 2/3 of the UK imports of butter, 40,000 tonnes. On the cheese side, 53%, over half of our cheese exports. And when you look at cheddar, it's 82% of all cheddar imports are coming, of all the UK's cheddar imports are coming from Ireland. And you say, well, why don't we just diversify that? And there are some other markets for cheddar, but obviously cheddar is a particularly British and Irish thing, maybe a Canadian thing, and is very much a small commodity outside those markets, because it's just not a traditionally eaten cheese. Maybe mixed in with mozzarella and applied as a pizza topping or something like that, but it isn't really going to sell in substantial volumes outside the UK. There are efforts being made there. The other thing is, well, then why don't you produce some other cheese? Yes, of course. Well, we go ahead and produce other cheeses, but the problem is it's a cheddar plant that produces, a cheddar processing plant that produces cheddar, and there are very few other cheeses you can make from the same processing plant. One is a cheese you may know, Dubliner, which is really a kind of a first cousin of cheddar. But it's the same issue in terms of food tastes. It's very difficult to diversify. So you've got all this fixed plant producing that cheddar, and really there's not a lot of opportunity to diversify into a different product. So the importance of the Northern Ireland, the All-Ireland, I suppose, economy in food. Look, it's been building for 45 years in terms of EEC membership, EU membership, so it's very closely integrated. The food chains there are. They've been touched on there, the issues of animal health and welfare, all of those things that provide for free movement. And you can see there, what's the value of the trade moving north and south. These are NI data there. You see there's almost the same amount in terms of value of food and live animal exports going north or coming south, 732 million pounds coming south, 796 million pounds going north. So it's very important that that isn't disrupted. But while that's very important and very valuable, actually the island's trading relationship with the other island is much bigger, 3 to 4 times that. So this is an important issue, yeah, north-south, but the bigger issue is really east-west, and we need to get our heads around that. 3 to 4 times more important. So the other thing is obviously in the north, people who are pro-Brexit in the DUP would point to the value of their trade with Britain and say, well, trade with the Republic is only 30%. Trade with Britain is 70% of their trade. I think our answer to that is, why would you want to give up 30%? You really should be sticking with looking for 100% and not be settling for disruption to 30%. But anyway, that's the just looking there at the Ireland situation, Northern Ireland situation. So what is the UK customs position? They're going to leave the single market and the customs union at the end of 2019. That's what they're saying. And they're proposing a traditional arrangement with an implementation period. This would go back to what they set out in their position papers in August. An implementation period they're talking about of up to 2 years after exit, in which the terms of trade would remain the same to allow businesses time to plan. So on the specifics, they've put forward 2 ideas. One is what they call a highly streamlined customs arrangement. And this basically would be built around technology, trusted trader agreements, things like that. No physical infrastructure, they would say, and an exemption for all small traders across the Irish border, which actually would account for 80% of trade, which doesn't add up. You cannot have an exemption. And the EU has said that very clearly. In other words, you heard earlier reference to, well, we have border posts. Yeah, we used to have, I think, border posts on about 17 roads going across the border, but there are 300 roads going across the border. So they were basically going to give up on regulating. Apart from the large traders, they were going to give up on regulating. Now that is, I think, seen as a non-runner, basically, on the basis that it was just a local market. But that is the white van trade, and that is basically a non-runner if you have different regimes applying on either side of the border. The other proposal that they put forward was a customs partnership, where the UK would undertake the EU's customs procedures for goods entering into the UK and destined for the EU. And then separately apply UK customs for goods entering the UK and destined for the UK market. And, you know, that again is, I think, seen as pie in the sky in Europe. It's just not seen as going to work. In other words, that the EU would allow the UK apply their customs procedures for goods that would be coming in and destined for the EU, coming into the UK and destined for the EU market. So they want to avoid a hard border. That's what they say. No physical infrastructure. That's what they say. But so they would undertake customs and phytosanitary checks on products coming into a UK port but destined for the EU market on behalf of the EU. And no need to check. That's what they say. Our position on that would be clearly that if they're conducting their own independent trade policy, you're going to end up with two different regimes, if that's what they want to do. If they want to have their own independent trade policy, there will be two different regimes on the island of Ireland or between Ireland and the UK. Because what if there would be different tariffs, they would have to be applied. If there are different food safety, animal health and production standards, they would have to be applied. That's between Ireland and the UK, but then imports that they would accept into the UK, those have to be regulated. So it's simply not possible, we would say, to have those kind of frictionless borders that they would wish to have. So if they want to minimize border checks or to eliminate border checks altogether, really they have to head in the direction and compromise in terms of their future trade ambitions. That is essential. There is a serious trade-off there. They must be prepared to compromise on their future trade ambitions with third countries in the area of food products. So the impact on potential sectors, I won't go into this in detail there. If you had, these are Chagas figures in the table, basically they say if you had, say, a 10% reduction in the CAP budget from the EU exit and reduced import tariffs, the impact of that on, that would be from pursuing a cheap food policy on UK prices, UK food prices. Average farm incomes here would fall 26%. Farm income down by 700 million. And the ESRI has done other figures there which are even worse, if you like. So, I mean, we all know these situations simply are unthinkable. To a hard border or a hard Brexit situation, a very hard Brexit situation, a crash out situation, I think is absolutely unthinkable. So how to respond? What do you do? I mean, it is a crazy, crazy situation. This is that famous painting that was sold for about 120 million, I think, in Sotheby's a couple of years ago, the Norwegian guy. The Scream, Edward Munch or something like that. But our, I suppose, a way of approaching this is really to try and get down to work in influencing people out in Brussels, where we are still the most influential farm organisation, Pat, in Europe. And that's what we're doing. So we're meeting with people right across the board, but in particular this guy, Barnier, with our policy proposals. We're saying our first key priority is maintaining access to and the value of the UK market, and that must be built into the EU's policy objectives. That's necessary. It's necessary to maintain access to and value of the UK market in order to maintain and to maximise the value of the EU market because of the displacement effect and the damage that would be done. We being such a huge exporter of food to the UK and the displacement effect in regard to the UK market. So what would the optimum outcome be? Would basically be that the UK would stay in the customs union and the single market. I mean, that is the perfect fix, you know, that they don't do it, basically. What's the next best option? Well, a comprehensive free trade agreement with tariff-free trade, maintenance of equivalent standards on all those areas that have been spelled out this morning: food safety, animal health, welfare, the environment. And as well as the standards issue being looked after, we need the common external tariff looked after, which means that the EU would have to apply the common external tariff. The UK, sorry, would have to apply the common external tariff. So in other words, the UK would not allow in, they would apply the same tariffs on imports as Europe does. And they wouldn't, that would prevent them from pursuing a cheap food policy. Is this allowable? Well, under GATT rules, we believe it is. I won't go into all the detail of that. We believe it is possible. What's this? Our second priority then would be on the CAP budget side. Basically, the CAP budget is 38% of the EU budget. The net reduction in the CAP budget arising from a UK exit is about 3 to 4 billion a year. And I think Alan Matthews has done a lot of work in that area. It's a significant hole in the CAP budget. So obviously you have, running alongside the Brexit negotiations, you have effectively the opening of internal EU policy making on the multi-annual financial framework for the next period, 21 to 28. And proposals on that are expected by the middle of next year. We would basically be saying that member states should, if necessary, increase their contribution to maintain the level of funding within the CAP, and that should be, if EU solidarity is worth anything, that's what should happen in this situation. So what are other Brexit priorities that we have then? They would be around support for market disturbance. That is particularly evident in relation to sterling and the volatility of sterling. In 2015, sterling was at a value of about 73p. In 2016, it was 82. And this year, the average is about 87 pence. So since the UK general election, it's fluctuated between 85 and 92. I think it's around 88 at the moment. But that is putting a serious stress on food processors and in turn on farmers. And we estimated that it was costing beef producers about €2 million a week in this back end. Now, of course, it fluctuates, but we were saying it was costing beef producers about 2 million a week. Well, for 1 or 2 weeks, that may not be a lot, but, you know, for 26 weeks, which is the second half of the year, that's 50 million and so on. So, you know, last year we would have said that the devaluation of sterling cost beef producers about 150 million. So sterling is a massive factor, and we think there should be EU support for market disturbance in that area, particularly when it goes over about the 85 level. Flexibility on state aid rules, these are other issues that increase support for marketing and promotion. The government is doing that. And of course, long-term structural and adjustment aid for sectors affected. So, just to give an overview of the negotiations as they are. So you had the Article 50 notification, 29th of March 17, two-year time frame. Well, one thing I think is pretty certain, that the UK are out on the 30th of March 2019, because it takes a unanimous decision of member states to extend that. So that looks pretty strong, and that's really what everybody has to be focused on. The negotiations began in June. This is the formal negotiations. The EU wants them concluded by October 2018, which is 11 months away, in order to allow for European Parliament ratification. And you know about these things, probably in phase one, the EU requirement is that there's sufficient progress on the divorce bill, citizens' rights and Ireland before moving to phase two. And what's phase two on? Well, phase two is on the transition and the framework for the future relationship. Note it's the framework for the future relationship, not actually the future relationship. The future relationship can only be done afterwards, when the UK is a third country. So the divorce bill, I suppose, is the major issue at the moment. And the point about Ireland, and I know there's coverage about this in the papers and on the news this morning in regard to the future arrangements on the border, that is all tied in to what the future is. You know, if the future is they're in the single market and customs union, you solve the problem. If the future isn't that, you don't. You have a serious problem, a very serious problem. So transition then, what is that all about? Well, the purpose is to provide stability, basically, that you stabilize the situation beyond March 19 for a period in order to allow the completion of the negotiations. And I think the British government is clearly in favour of this. I think the EU will be in favour of this because it's clearly in everybody's interest to avoid a cliff edge. Because the kind of cliff edge that would happen with no transition, I think, as Alan was saying, is just, it's massive and it is really not possible. So the EU would be saying that the agreement on a future relationship, including a free trade agreement, an FTA, can only be concluded when the UK leaves, when it's a third country, and the transition period must be clearly defined, limited in time, and subject to effective enforcement mechanisms. And that could include prolonging what's called the EU acquis, which is basically the total body of EU legislation to govern the transition. What the UK wants then is an implementation period of about 2 years, during which, and this is from her Florence speech, access to one another's markets should continue on current terms. That's what Theresa May said then. And they want to have reached an agreement on future partnership by March 19. So what is then the future relationship? I think there's a reasonably good chance of getting a transition deal, but what is the future relationship? Let's just look. No deal means going over the cliff edge. So what does that really mean? No deal. It means immediate hard border, customs procedures to ensure goods qualify for access, SPS rules of origin checks, delays, huge costs to supply chains, prohibitive tariffs if you go out with no deal each way. The UK would be on default WTO most favoured nation tariffs unless they adjusted those, and the EU would be applying the common external tariff. Basically, it's unthinkable to go in this direction in 18 months' time. So what's the UK opening position then in terms of the future relationship? Well, they're saying they want to be no longer members of the single market or the customs union, and that they make their own trade negotiations. That's their position. They're talking about a balance of rights and obligations. Now this is from the Florence speech. They recognise they can't have all the benefits. A new, deep and special partnership, and they bring in other things, security and other issues, apart from just an economic partnership. They say it can't be based on the European Economic Area because the EU would set the rules and they'd have no say. And they couldn't go for the Canadian deal. They say, well, that was grand for Canada, but sure, we can do a lot better than that. So they're saying there should be no tariffs, And they're saying that they would have a commitment to high regulatory standards without defining that or how that would be framed. And a strong and appropriate dispute resolution mechanism, and again, without defining that or how it would be done. But there is movement in the UK position. And I did an interesting thing there just in the last couple of days when I was thinking about this paper. I did a word count on the word global in the Lancaster House speech and the word global in the Florence speech. So Lancaster House is global Britain. You may remember that from the start of the year in January. And the word global appeared 18 times. In Florence, the word global appeared twice. So the UK is gradually recognizing the realities of the situation. Now, they don't publicly put it forward so well, and I think, you know, they could be and should be a lot more honest with the UK public in how they set out their position, and they really, really need to do that. The UK position, the EU position is not defined as yet. What happened in the October summit was they said, you know what, we'll go up and we'll have our own internal discussions about that. That's the EU 27. Now, not defined, but yesterday there was a very interesting speech by Michel Barnier in, am I doing on time? By Michel Barnier in Rome. And he basically said what it means to leave on Brexit. He said, it's not possible to be half in and half out of the single market. Not possible to be half in and half out. Not possible to end free movement of persons while retaining free movement of goods, services, or capital by means of a generalized system of equivalences. Not possible to leave the single market and continue to set the rules. In other words, we'll set the rules, you take our rules. Not possible to leave the customs union but expect to enjoy frictionless trade with the EU. There'll be no future partnership without common rules. There will be no close trade links without a level playing field. Establishing the rules will not be easy. It's more a matter of managing divergence than encouraging convergence. Very interesting speech. Went much further than anything I've seen since well, at all. So some observations. I think if you think phase one was difficult, phase two is going to be a lot more difficult. And we're not finished with phase one yet. UK business, they need certainty on transition by early 18, otherwise the value of it begins to disappear because businesses have to put in place contingency plans and so on. And I think the UK will end up applying the EU acquis. In other words, they'll just keep applying all the law. A mechanism will be found to do it. They'll have to go that way. I just don't think they're going to have time to do it any other way. And the EU holds the cards in this. The UK cannot have its cake and eat it. The deeper the free trade agreement they get, the greater the loss of control. So there's very difficult trade-offs for the UK here. They can have a close relationship with the single market and the customs union, maybe not quite membership, but maybe very close. But that means regulatory alignment on standards, supply chains not impacted on the goods covered, passporting for financial services, maybe they might get that. The French are mad keen to stop them getting it. But they would have budget contributions and they would have very limited ability to actually negotiate free trade deals. The things that they want to barter in free trade deals, they would be limited in doing. Or you can go to the other end and you can have a shallow free trade agreement with zero tariffs. They can regulate away freedom to negotiate free trade deals with third countries, but no budget contributions, but costly friction at borders, very costly. There was also an interesting statement there by Wilbur Ross, the US Commerce Secretary, the other day. And I'm just winding up on these few observations. What he said was, and these highlight the UK's dilemma, He wants the UK to deliver continued passporting for financial services for all the American banks in London, while rejecting EU food standards. And he mentioned GM crops, chlorine-washed chicken, and I'm sure if he kept going, he would have talked about hormone beef and other things. So in other words, he's setting out what is the US agenda. This is the kind of deal he wants. And he said there'll be landmines if we can't get these things. And it could take 10 years to do the deal between the EU, between the UK and the US. Other observations, the UK government is divided. It doesn't really know what it wants. It certainly hasn't settled on what it wants. But even if you look at the US situation, the EU accounts for 44% of UK exports. The US accounts for 15%. There's no sense in what is being proposed here in terms of the damage on one side and the potential gain on the other side. Our risk, and the risk to us, is that the self-harm that the UK is willing to do itself is going to damage us. That's the problem. So the conclusions, we say agriculture and food have to remain an absolute priority for Ireland, and we must influence the players, the key players. We must influence the EU negotiators, other member states, but also our UK colleagues. So Europe, we believe, and this is our view in IFA, must make agriculture one of its priorities. And I think we'll get as far as transition, but the next part is going to be maybe even more difficult.